In this video, we will create a blended height map in Gaea. This example you're seeing on the screen is one terrain exported from Gaea as a height map with two separate RGB masks. And within those mask rules are rules for vegetation. We'll then use those rules in Unity to place trees all procedurally. So first of all, I'd like to thank the comments that I've been getting, asking questions and making requests. This video here is inspired by two of those. So keep those coming. If there's anything particular you want to see, it actually helps me dive deeper. For this biome tutorial, I'm going to start with a preset. I'm just going to use in the landscape grouping, I'm going to choose flowing mountains. And I'm going to take the last two nodes and shift them down to represent a terrain alternative that's more arid or desiccated. And I'm going to represent that with the fractal terraces node. As you can see, it created like an erosive sandstone type formation. Now I think in my case I want a more subtle effect. So one way to do that, you can adjust the settings, but a lot of times what I'll do is I'll just drag output to output. And you can do that if they're in the chain, in the same chain. So me doing that automatically sets it to a 50% blend. So based upon our original, it's a little bit more eroded. And we can go ahead and bump it up to 1K just to see more detail for a high resolution. Okay, so this will represent the terrain. In fact, I might go ahead and throw a surface node on it, which is like a fancy sharpening node. But I set this in half to 12 strength instead from 25, and that just makes it a little more subtle. And this is as far as I wanted to go with this example. So I'm going to go ahead and make this the portal to be used in the second process. And I'm going to rename surface to arid. And now for our tropical track, what I'll do is a thermal which it's kind of like a subtle alluvial and erosion together. As you can see, the deposits that formed, which will give a flatter surface, smoother surface where the forest could be. And then I'll follow up with erosion, just the default settings, just to settle it in a little bit more. And I guess with this one, I'll go ahead and do a surface node with it as well. And change its strength to 12. And for fun, we'll change it to rocky setting. From this macro view, a lot of the settings you're not going to get to know intimately from this view. It really is trial and error on the output that it provides in Unity from the ground perspective or from wherever camera angle that your game expects. So you kind of have to grow a new eyeball for being able to pick up those details and knowing what the pitfalls are. Because this right here, for example, is going to be very lumpy from the terrain view. Even though if you're looking on a broad view, it may not look so bad. So that's a taste that you're going to have to salt over time as you get to know how cause and effect occurs with the nodes. It looks like I pinned this, or yeah, underlaid. That was a mistake. Okay, so we have it. This one's complete as well. I'm going to go ahead and mark it, make a portal, and rename this. I'll just say jungle. And one more thing I want to show off here is a boreal node. We can actually, to aid in our next step in Unity, or in a later step, we can actually populate the terrain with locations of where vegetation could grow based upon which biome it is. So here in the jungle node, I'm going to pull out a boreal. Okay, and this is the default growing pattern where it kind of avoids the flows, because theoretically in a lush environment there'd be heavy water rainfall and it would kind of decimate things that aren't well rooted. And I'm going to change from conifers to shrubs just to change the profile. And I want to change the style from small to large and fuzzy, and that just fills it in a little bit more. So there's still like little broken openings, but in my view, in my mind, I'm thinking this green is going to represent a texture rule that we can pick up in Unity and actually use that to target, to plant our forest or our jungle. So this looks pretty good. We can go ahead and export this, and we're going to export the colorize output as a portal. I'm going to call it jungle. And we can do a desert version of this. By changing, well, we'll go ahead and change to shrubs. And we'll change from the inhibitor from flowing avoid, we'll change it to seek, and it'll actually reverse this pattern. Because if you see in the desert, it's easy to pinpoint where the water flow is because that's where stuff grows. And so that's what it's expecting here, is everything where water would flow is where we have soil. And I'm going to reduce the health just to thin out the numbers a little bit. That looks fine. And there we go. We can go ahead and make a portal for this. And I'll rename it Arid. Okay, so the next process is how do we combine these? And it's pretty simple. We're going to use the gradient with the default settings. This doesn't need to be come off of there. So we have gradient, and then we'll go to ABS. And those together give us this stair-step pattern. And what we can do is from what this is going to do when we blend this is it's going to be a sharp line for each half of the map for the two different terrains. So I'm going to throw a blur on the ABS and just bump it up to maybe 3, just to round over that corner, and that'll help blend the two terrain textures to differentiate the biomes. So from here we want to grab our portals for the Heightmap nodes. So I'm going to use FX. Go up here. To grab a portal, we pull out from the input and we release, and it gives us the list of portals we created. I'm going to do Arid. Another FX. And we're going to grab jungle. And I'm actually going to reverse the order of these. It kind of matters at least in my mind, I'm going to have the jungle more north. It's going to be at the top of this perspective, and the arid in the bottom. So for that to work, these actually have to be stacked this way. They're actually stacked reversely. And then all we do is we combine these. We move output to output. That creates a blend, and we bump up to 100%. And from here, we mask our combine, because what it actually looks like is that's the jungle layer, because of the way it's blended. But if we mask with our gradient, it's actually going to cut away half of this. And there we go. So we have the arid area toward the bottom and our jungle biome toward the top. Now we don't need to I'm not going to go through texturing this in Gaea for each biome. There's actually a preset called the swipe, I believe. So one of the presets that inspired this tutorial that breaks it down. It's actually blending 3 different biomes. If you want to see how that texturing works, you can check that out. And from here, we can start building a rule set. So the plan is we're going to build in this case we can't use a splat RGBA because that won't work correctly in Unity with the terrain tools. We have to pack an RGB node. So we only have 3 channels to work with. Now in theory you could stack RGBs, and you could have 2 RGBs representing jungle and 2 RGBs representing desert if you wanted 6 different textures for each. That's a possibility, but I'm going to keep this kind of simple because this is quite technical. So the 3 channels that I'm going to target are the rock, the arboreal color zones that we created for the vegetation, and then basically everything else. And that'll give us what we can use in our RGB masks, and we'll export 2 of those, one for arid, one for jungle. So let's do that. The way I do rock is I start with slope, and I change the minimum to 40, oops, and the maximum to 90. So that gives us all the steep parts above 40 degrees. That can be adjusted to your taste. And then I follow up with a protrusion, which is kind of a convex rule. And the default settings aren't quite right. I like to bump up the power to about 11 to half. Apply the changes. And that'll create more of a contrast here. It'll remove some of the noise. But I need to brighten this up and clean it up a little more. So what I'm going to do is use clip post-process on the protrusion node. I'm going to click clip, and it creates this oops. We have a clip min and a clip maximum. Now if we bump up the clip minimum, what it's going to do is take away the lighter values. Well, when I say lighter, I mean the dimmer, the lesser values, which would be the gray, the dark gray. The brighter, the bigger values are the white. That's like the ridge line. So we'll see here. I'm going to bump this up. We're going to see it darkened everything. And I'm probably going to go up just a little bit more. And then I'm going to click on Shaper node, which is this, it's kind of like an arrowhead. And that creates this red bar. And it starts off neutral. There's no default effect, but we're going to bump it to the right. And what I'm looking for is just that this brightens up enough to be a valid rule. So I think that looks okay right there. So this is the values if you want to try or match mine. Clip min is 25 and shaper is 53%. And then what we'll do is just add these together. So drag output to output, it creates a combine, and we're going to add these. And I think I'm going to bump the value down just a little. By having not quite a full blend, it has like little dark patches, and that kind of fakes an extra texture. It just won't be a full strength rock. So you can't use it too harshly, but a little effect adds a little value. So there's our rock texture. It's almost complete, but we need to build these other rules. So for our arboreal, I'm going to add an FX. And then I'm going to pull out from the input and choose the portal. And I'm going to choose jungle arboreal for this example. So I'm presuming we're working in the jungle biome first. And so there's our color rule for it. Now, one thing we can do is subtract out the rock to allow the rock to be dominant. And that'll prevent on the steep cliffs our forest floor texture or whatever vegetation texture we're representing on this rule. And there we go. So we have our vegetation, we have our rock, and we only have one other thing, and we need to kind of account for all the pixels. So we're just going to create a soil texture or a soil node, and then we're going to invert it, which gives us everything else, and then we're going to add these together. So adding, and there we go. So now we have basically a blank slate of representing everything, and what we can do is subtract. I'm going to do a multi-combine to subtract our two other nodes. Change it to subtract 100%, and then I'm just going to remove our rock, there it is, and I'll remove our vegetation. There we go. So all this white will be our remaining soil. And if it's a little too sharp of a transition, we could throw a blur on there. In fact, it's probably a good idea to throw a blur on here, because sometimes it can show up as little squares, and from the ground perspective, if you can see, that might be noticeable. So I'm going to throw a blur on that as well, and that just fades it a little more. Okay, so we have our 3 channels. We can go ahead and pack our RGB. We're not using splat, we're using RGB mix. And I'm just going to do these in whatever order. And there we go. There's our RGB. It's good because we have bright, vivid colors that are well represented, that aren't a mixture of it. Now, if you can blend it, and you'll notice purples and yellows instead of greens and blues. But that's more of an advanced finesse technique. So here we have this done. We can actually duplicate this so we don't have to do it again, because the rules can be the same. You know, adjustments may need to be made, but the way to duplicate it, if you just drag across and duplicate, it's actually going to deselect this group. It's going to paste the other group on top of it, and you're going to have a hard time picking through to get what you copied. So what you do is you select it, you do Control-C to copy, and then you shift this up before you paste, and then Control-V, and that'll move it out of the way. But it breaks the connections, so we have to make the better connections. For example, this FX represented the arboreal, so now we need to grab the arid arboreal portal. And then the height map is the same, so we'll do that. And the invert needs it as well. Oops. I'm getting ahead of myself. So yeah, we have the height map attached here. But one thing that we're forgetting is we need to have 2 maps, 2 RGB maps that have half of the terrain colorized. So this isn't going to work. They're going to both be competing with each other. What we need to do is mask the nodes, the data nodes, with our gradient absolute, and that will dissect the RGB mix. You'll see here in a second. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab from the ABS. I think this is the right one. No, this is backwards. So what it's doing is I just made our gradient absolute mask a mask for arboreal, but what it did was give us the top half of the map, and that wasn't my intention. So what we need to do here is invert this, and just to make it more clear, I'm going to move this above so it'll associate with the jungle, and the inversion of that will represent the mask for the lower half of the map. So all of these get a mask. Okay, and you can see it's black and fuzzy. And here we have black and or colorized and fuzzy. So that represents the blending of the two biomes that fade, and the other one will fade from the other side. Okay, so let's now use our non-inverted mask to mask our jungle. And our boreal. Okay, so the RGB mix for that shows the top half and our bottom half. So we're good to go. This is ready to import into Unity. I'm going to mark these for export. And then we need our Heightmap, which in this case is the combine. And we can rename that. So what it was asking me was, does it want me to rename this on the output settings Heightmap as well? And I said yes, because that's going to make it clear. So for Heightmap, we want raw. And for the RGB mixes, we can actually name those if we want. Jungle. And arid. Okay, and these need to be PNGs. So we've got raw for Heightmap and PNG for the two biome RGB masks. We want to change the resolution to 1K. Raw is the range, and I had the proportional is by default. You want to scroll up to choose raw, and that's what I'll be setting. All right, we're going to build this, export this, and I'll meet you. So here I am in a new Unity 2021 project. I've pre-installed Microsplat, regular free version. I've pre-installed the terrain tools, which is a Unity package that I introduced in the Simple Island tutorial episode 2. I've installed a asset pack for jungle. I have some PBR textures that I can use to build the arid environment, and I have Vegetation Studio, the standard version, installed. If you don't have Vegetation Studio, now's the time to pick it up. In a few hours it's going to be on 70% off on the asset store, so you want to grab that. Otherwise, it's just a really good prototyping tool, even if you don't use it in a production game, because it allows you to build your vegetation very easily procedurally rather than having to paint it on. So in my scene here, I'm going to open, I have it already opened, but I want to open up the terrain toolbox. So from the window, terrain toolbox, that'll give us this here. On the create new terrain tab, I'm going to enter the Gaea world space, which is 5 kilometers by 5 kilometers by 2,600 kilometers. You just saw me overwrite half of those values, and you can use half of the values and it'll actually create a 2K resolution terrain. It'll just be half the size. And in case you're wondering, it's not the same as a legitimate 2K export from Gaea, or yes, from Gaea. If you were thinking about getting the indie version or one of the paid versions, there's actually more detail than would show up from this little hack. But in this case, I'm going to do the full 5K by 5K. And we want to select import Heightmap. We're going to check the raw option. And I'm going to select the Heightmap we just created. And we're flipping the axis on the vertical axis. That's important. And that's it. We click create. Okay, here's our world. And for sanity's sake, we have here our fractal terraces, our desiccated landscape, and then toward the top is the more of a jungle view. So we selected the right one. If you're getting one if you're not getting a blended terrain like this, then you might have exported the wrong node. So just go back in the video and compare that with what you have. So now that we have our height map, I'm going to go to the inspector and select our terrain. And I'm going to add layers. Now I have this little palette that I can just throw in here. And what's important here, I had mentioned in the Simple Island tutorial we used a splat node which had the RGBA, but that doesn't actually work in Unity for this technique. That's why we chose the RGB, and we're only working with 3 channels per color map. However, the terrain tools still presumes you're loading an RGBA, and it needs to be represented, otherwise it's going to throw the numbers off. So it's a little complicated, but what we need is we need a throwaway texture in the 4th and 8th slots. So my 3 desirable textures for my jungle, which will be the first splat map that I load, is going to be this rock, it's going to be a forest texture, and a patchy grass. The 4th texture, sand, I'm actually going to remove that, but it needs to be there during the import process. If it's not there, then it's going to still think that there's this invisible channel, and it's going to really mess you up. So just follow this carefully, and it'll make sense as you get used to it that it's expecting you to load 4 channels. So we have those 4 channels accounted for. The next 4 channels are the arid textures that I'm going to use, and I'm actually going to move this one down. So it's going to be a lighter color, sandy terrain. So now that we have 8 textures here, we can go to the terrain toolbox again. We'll click on the terrain utilities tab, and terrain layers we want to import. You're probably not going to have any there, but we need to import, and I think it was already loaded the way I want it, so you didn't see a change on screen. But once you have your 8 textures loaded, then see, this is already here. Let me remove that. Then you can click import from selected terrains, and it's going to calculate based on this how many divisions of 4 do you have, and that's how many splats it's going to expect. And if you have the numbers wrong, you're going to get an error saying that the terrain can't support it, something along those lines. So it needs to line up. We need to work in groupings of 4. So it's ready for 2 splat alphas, and in this case we're going to do jungle at the top and arid at the bottom, and then we apply it to terrain. So it imprinted it, and it looks washed out because these bogus layers that we added, we're going to checkbox we're going to checkbox each of those, and we're going to choose remove selected layers. And what that's going to do is reveal the actual layers that represent those channels that we packed. So it looks like I've got my rock texture in the wrong spot. I think it needs to go in the middle. Yeah, so rock up high, and then we have kind of the more yellowy texture represents the jungle, and then the patchy grass, which has a green tone, is in the flows. So that's what I built. And then down here it looks like we have, there we go, there's the lime, there's a lighter limestone. It's actually the same texture, I just tinted it in an image editing program, so the tiling should match. And then the other 2 represent the prevailing soil and wherever the vegetation will grow. And that could be a dead tree, it could be one of those little dust devils that roll around along the desert floor. Let's see how it looks reversed. think that's okay. But yeah, and this is a simple implementation of mapping where the textures will show up in Gaea. But we have these locations, these little blotches. That's where we can use Vegetation Studio, and I'll go ahead and add that to the scene. So once it's installed, in the window menu, you'll have Awesome Technologies, and you choose Add Vegetation Studio to Scene. And if you got the Pro version, then you already know this, and I don't have to go through that. The standard is fine. And the way you do it is you open up the parent Vegetation Studio object, and you grab the system, and then you start it. And what it's wanting is to add a package. So I already have a package, but I'm just going to create another one. So you right click in your project window, and under Awesome Technologies, and no textures is fine. So we have that there, and that's what we'll drag into this box, and it should make this arrow go. And what I'm going to do is we're going to select from my pack, and I'll link the pack that I'm using. It's a tropical jungle pack, and it's compatible with Vegetation Studio. I think some trees might have issue, not all work, so that's a factor in deciding if you want to follow the process that I'm going. And what I'm going to do is choose a palm tree. This is a papaya tree. We'll say coconut palm tree. We'll choose that. And I'm going to drag that over onto tree. And what that's going to do is paint trees everywhere. But what I'm going to do now is I want to target here in, I'm going to collapse these so it's not confusing if you're not familiar with this tool. In the main vegetation items grouping, there is a terrain texture rules option. You want to open that up. Then you want to choose include terrain textures. You actually click on that. And then you can add an item. And what that's doing is providing you with a list of textures from your terrain that it can obey what you want from it. So if we have, this is all within the context of whatever vegetation item selected. In this case, we only have palm tree. So what it did is it selected the number 1 slot because that's the default one. And as you can see, the trees went away and it's populated over here. And that's actually where we want them to represent our jungle. That's the texture for the forest floor. So from here you can adjust the slope. There's so many adjustments, but for this tutorial I'm going to keep it simple. But the thing is, I also want palm trees in my desert. So what I'm going to do is add a new item, and then I'm going to choose slot 4 because we have 3 for jungle and 3 for arid. And I know that the number 1 slot is going to be the right one. I might have that backwards. Oh, there we go. Yeah. So yeah, texture 4 is represented as the texture in the channel that we exported from Gaea where we want vegetation in our arid zone. So as you can see, it put palm trees in the flows where it simulated it in Gaea. So from a ground perspective, you can see that that's a lot of palm trees. We can reduce that a couple ways. Now for this one, if we have the desert one selected, it's going to plant trees from a 10% texture value up to a full 100%. So if we bump this up to 0.6, it'll reduce the number of trees. That's one way to do it. If we want to add a lush jungle of many different plants, we can do a relative rule for this, or relative density for this tree, and maybe that's too much for in here. So what we can do is under position, is it position? Yes, under the position selector, there's density, and that's right now it's 100%. We can change that to half, and it should recalculate half as many of those. And then we can go back to our desert, and it should adjust those. So if we want to use that as a rule, and we can even add that same tree twice if you want to double it up in the jungle in that example. But in this case, I'm going to bump it down to 22%, and that reduces it even more. So that's a little bit more realistic. And you can add grass, like small little shrubs, cactus, whatever you have. I want this video to be kind of precise on the process, and I expect you to run with it and make some great worlds with it. But I hope this was helpful. I'm going to leave it here, and we'll pick up with another tutorial at some other time. If you wanted this transition, now that I'm seeing it from this angle, if you want that to be more gradual, you just increase the blur here on the absolute. You just have to, on the absolute properties, you just kick up the blur to maybe 6 or 7, and that'll give you more of a transition, more of a gradient between the two biomes. But the proof of concept is here, so I hope this helps and empowers your world building. Let me know how it goes, and we'll see you in the next video.